I am assembling my head. To start, I just got everything in. On the exhaust side, I just put these in. I had some other ones that were a little harder to hammer in or get in there, but these seem pretty good. They're from Schnitz. And then I have my studs, which go long side in first, or the longer threaded part, and then the barrel section will stick out. Before I put the header on, I need to get all my valves set. So what I need to do, or how I do this, is I take my retainer and I drop one side in and the other. I just stuck the retainers inside. Now this is the hard part that you're not going to see, but again, I am pushing down and I'm wiggling it back and forth a little bit. Once they're in there, I just release it. Now on the bottom side with my finger, I'm making sure that that valve seat or the bottom thing is actually sitting on the valve. Alright, so next what I think I'm going to do, since the head, I just need the one spring, but it's on the intake side, so I shouldn't have to worry about the header, is I'm going to take the header and put that on. And as I think I said earlier, I already installed new gaskets, and I installed my studs, which are the longer length threaded into the inside. And I just dropped my camera. But this goes on, it's fairly snug. I do just kind of take a rubber mallet make sure it goes on. Should be good. And I'm going to put some anti-seize on the threads, tighten it down. What I don't quite like are it came with these kind of copper nuts. They're okay, but they tend to strip easily, as you can tell by some of that. They sit on the bottom edge, but with the head off, it'll make me, at least it'll give me a little more room to get my hand in there, get them tight. These ones are just Allen head screws. Alright, I guess that's all. You don't need an instruction how to do that, just put the bolts in. So next is going to be, I am going to install, this time, a head spacer. This is an 80 thousandths head spacer out of aluminum. Already got my head studs in. Now the block isn't actually fastened together. I'm just kind of, again, I'm doing a little bit backwards, getting prepared for the head to go on. So I laid down a bead of silicone because there's no real gasket there, and I just have this, I don't know, like make your own gasket stuff, oil resistant, higher temperature. Didn't have a problem on the last motor. So now I'm basically just going to push this on and make sure everything seems to seal well. Just a little bit of pressure there. And then I'm going to end up doing a second bead on this side of it. And then the head will go on top of that. Alright, hopefully you can kind of see this, but again, I've oiled the block a little bit. This is the bottom side of it. I took the rings, they are positioned properly on each piston, and I did label the pistons depending on what they go on. So the way I found was easiest to install the pistons was not actually from the top of the block. I do have some spring or piston ring compressors, and then you kind of hammer it in, but I just did not have any luck with the damn thing. The nice thing with the Boosta Gen 2 block is right here. So I could actually stick it in, compress the rings, and not need anything else. Now the one thing I did try is you have to make sure is once you get it in, not to twist the piston. Try to get it in as straight as you can, because the rings will stay and not be in the correct position. So I will stick them in. This is number 2. And I just squeeze them lightly. I'm not trying to force these things in. And try to go in as straight as I possibly can. Okay. So one down. So that's it. Got all 4 pistons in the block. Again, they're all facing the correct way. You might want to set them in about as far as you can go down, just so you can have room to fudge when you put it in and line them up to the crank. But other than that, these will go on. I'm going to go put some silicone around the edges between the block, along with I got to reattach my oil pump, and then the block should be going on. And then I will show you a little trick I used because I wasn't sure exactly how to hold everything, especially with the studs, but a little trick I used. Okay, so now it's time to put the head on the block. To make my life a little bit easier, I'm actually going to turn the block onto one side. That way the rods don't drop to one end and I got to fiddle with them. So I'm going to turn on its side, put the block on. That will allow me to kind of fiddle and adjust and get everything aligned so I don't spill my oil. Okay. Okay, so now I got to make sure that the rods actually line up on the crank. And after I get that done, actually I think what I ended up doing is I'm going to take the bottom part of the block off. That way I can access all the rod bolts. I'll torque those down. Took off the bottom of the block in order to get to the crank rods. What I'm going to do now is just rotate these very slowly, at least until I can get some of them lined up. I want to make sure that my other half matches up to the correct one. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go back, torque all the bolts twice, 2 different settings until their maximum, I think, is 45 for these rods. And then put a little bit more silicone on the block again, reassemble the block, start putting bolts in it. So next is, there's a diagram in the book manual that shows the places where you want to put silicone on between the blocks. So I've already placed it here, as you can see. And next is, I am just going to slide the block over. See if that works there. Alright, so now it's time to put the block back together. I've torqued them down to 40 foot-pounds. That's at least the specs per my rods. The only thing that's a little bit complicated, not too hard, is lining up the forks on the transmission. That's much better. The batteries are running low. Everything looks good. I'm going to start with my main stud bolts. Once I get everything together, I'm going to put on the oil pan and the pickup and close up the bottom. Alright, so I'm getting the main studs on. I just figured I'd mention this to everybody. Remember, the copper goes on the outside. I'm putting just a dab of blue Loctite on the outside studs, only not for really worrying, but for sealing. I did have one of these start leaking last time I put the motor together, and I fixed it. Not a big deal, but just something for later on that I might have a little bit of trouble with. Just to keep that in mind. There's one other bolt. I know it's kind of late if you're taking your motor apart. But before you start banging it apart and cussing at it, there's one bolt that I don't know why they thought about this. Now granted, I don't have a balancing shaft. This is just a blank shaft because I ended up having my crank balanced by APE. There is that hole down here that is basically one of these bolts sits down in there, and it's a pain in the ass to get to. If you have the balancer here, you can't get enough room to get a socket there. It's just a fun one to do. So keep in mind, don't forget that bolt. Or if you're missing a bolt or have an extra one, then that's probably where it came from. Alright, good, it's still recording. So now I'm going to tighten down the main bolts. It does have sequence. It says to do 13 foot-pounds, then 23 foot-pounds. So now I'm going to go through and do that. Alright, so next is I'm going around and doing the outside bolts. The smallest ones are 8 foot-pounds. Then there's some 19 foot-pounds and 36 foot-pounds for the one, which should be only this one back here. For the 8 foot-pounds, I'm just going to use my hand. And of course I'm missing a bolt. So now I'm going to put on my oil pan, that way I can actually flip the motor over and do the other side. Don't forget the O-ring for your pickup. And I actually have a swinging pickup, so I just got to make sure it's will swing in the right direction. Alright, so now it's just time to do the upper bolts of the block and head. I'm just going to tuck this cord back. Right. So now I'm going to put the upper head or upper block bolts in, and hopefully I don't hear any cracking noises this time. These should also be 19 foot-pounds. I'm about to put on the head. One thing to remember that I messed up the first time is you actually need to put this for the cam chain guide, I guess I'll call it, that runs down to the bottom. You need to put that in first, or else you can't get it on after. So it's kind of a pain in the ass, especially with the studs, because they actually push. It pushes out. So I'm going to leave it loose. There's a bolt that goes on down below, but for now I'm going to leave it like that. The next hard part is holding the chain while you're putting on the head. And as I'm putting on the head, as it gets closer, I'm going to push this back tensioner section into place, and hopefully it all falls together. I can find, got this little tool here. Okay, now make sure you have this and the washer that goes with it. The first time I assembled the motor, I figured, oh, I'll just wait and I can get the motor in and I can get this gasket later. Well, unfortunately, this thing is blocked by part of the frame, so I could not get to it, and I had to drop the motor again, find that piece, and get it put back together. Okay, so that'll keep my cam chain from falling. Now what I'm going to do is on this side, I'm going to put the bolt in. I'm going to put these two guys on, probably this one, and I'll start to just lightly hand tighten down the head stud bolts. So next order of business is that bolt right there, or that bolt hole, I guess I should say, which takes this guy here and holds the actual tensioning, I don't know what you call, arm for the cam chain. Well, it was stripped, so I went and on Amazon got this nice little kit of helicoils and all the metrics. So it comes like, I don't know, 15 pieces a piece, the tap, the little guy for installing those things. Hopefully it works and it's good enough to keep me going, so I don't have to weld up the hole and re-tap it in some way. So now I'm going to take care of that so I can move on with this process. Manual. For the cylinder head, to bolt it down, it actually wants you to do 37.5 foot-pounds. But if you go on to APE Race Parts, where they sell the cylinder studs, they want you to torque those things down to 65 foot-pounds. It's a bit fun, but I'm going to do 2 torque settings. I'll probably set it about 30, and then do the second one at 65. So again, this one is the fun one because it's hard to hold this motor, so I'll try to stick my hand in here to keep it from spinning, and just try to do the best I can. I'm going to see if I can get my other torque wrench and use that one just to give me a little more leverage. As you can see, it might be a little easier if you have a actual motor stand. But I can get it done. The head is torqued down to 65 foot-pounds. Now I'm just going to start connecting small things like these oil lines, get those out of the way, and then I will start putting the camshafts in. And you kind of have to hold the cam chain. Yep, so everything turns nice and easy. So now I've got some of this Torco engine assembly lube. I'm just going to end up putting this on the camshaft bearings and all in these spots, just to give it some extra lubrication. You will need a decent amount. It's oil soluble. But since I'm going to be turning them a lot, taking them apart, moving them, you can use a decent amount. Put it also on the camshafts. So I know this looks like chicken scratch, but these are my old specs on when I was doing a shim adjustment. So I think what I'm going to do is put the same shims that were underneath each one, and then I'm going to go back and check the clearances to make sure they're correct. If not, I will adjust them. Okay, so I've got my shims under buckets ready. My camshafts are fairly in place. Now I'm not going to put the cam chain on. I guess some people could. What I'm going to try to do is just get it so the pistons are down a little bit so they won't hit the valves. And I'm just going to rotate my camshaft once I get it bolted down with a spanner wrench, just so I can measure the gap, and then because it's going to be coming on and off a couple times, and get it figured out. I have feeler gauges here. I'm looking for two different sizes. On the intake side, I need 6 to 8 thousandths, and on the exhaust is 8 to 10 thousandths gap. So the lobe up, and I'm just going to keep rotating the camshafts. But I'm taking this shim and I'm sticking it in here. So this one is too thick, and this is a 4 thousandths. So obviously it's already way too tight. But I need to figure out how tight it is so I can reduce the shim by that much. So 1.5 thousandths, it's hard to gauge because it's such a flimsy thing. But you get the idea. So I want to be, these are exhaust, so 8 to 10 thousandths gap. So I'll just keep going, and then I'll rotate, I'll keep rotating the camshaft and check each and every one of these. I'll write down on my sheet what I have, and then I'll do the calculation of taking millimeters to thousandths and basically dividing 25.4 into whatever number I have, and then I can come up with whatever shim I need. A little bit complicated, but that's what you got to do. So I'm going to go through this. It'll take a little bit of time, and then I'll come back and figure out what shims I got to do. Alright, so now that I've got the first part done, I'm taking them off. I'm going to record which ones were okay, I don't need to touch, and which ones I do need to add a little bit of shim or take some away. So I'm going to continue doing that. It'll be a little while, so I'm just going to stop the video. You guys will have to figure out where you go from there. Okay, so now where I'm at is I have all my shim sizes that I currently have. I have the gaps that are in between each one. I wrote OK for the ones that I don't need to adjust, and I left the buckets on them. That way I know not to touch them. They're within my camshaft specs of 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 thousandths. For here you can actually do calculations to get it all figured out and figure out what shim you need, or you can take a stab at it. If you're pretty close by 1,000th, I'm going from I want to increase the height of it, which will reduce the number of thousandths of clearance. So I'm going from a 262 to 265. It might be okay at a 270. This one is this one's too small of a gap, so I want to reduce this number down. I'm going to go to 265. It's kind of a guessing game. It shouldn't be too bad, but these are just some ways that I've figured it out. Alright, so now for the hard part. Well, at least everything is hard, but putting the cam chain on and making sure the camshafts are aligned. On my exhaust camshaft, I have 2 dots that are supposed to be vertical, and then on my intake I have 3 dots which are supposed to be vertical, and those need to be in line with each other. So the easiest way is to try to get the camshaft chain on one of them and then stretch it over. At the same time, you also need to make sure piston number 1 is at top dead center. And I am actually going to use a little bit of Loctite, and I'm going to put it on with my impact gun because it actually needs to be torqued down way more than I can actually do by hand and hold the motor. So it's easiest to use my impact and just hope that it's enough, because I believe it's like 65 foot-pounds on there. I've also found you kind of have to roll it into its seat pocket. The problem is when you roll it in, it will shift. So you have to almost compensate for it and roll it in, and then it'll eventually get to the right place. Obviously, once you finally get the right one, or at least it in one time, it seems to go a little bit easier the next. But you kind of get the idea. Right now I'm just checking to make sure the number 2 is straight up. However, my number 3 is a little bit too much canted to the right, so I am going to reshift it one tooth. At least that's the plan. And not squeeze my finger in there. Okay. Alright, so now they're both vertical. That should be good. I'm going to put one more zip tie on there just to make sure I hold it. Make sure that you're still in alignment. Now I'm going to cut the zip ties. Next, I'm going to put my cam chain tensioner. Now, this is a manual cam chain tensioner. I don't know if I'm still a fan of them or not, but you know, the automatic does have its perks. You can over tighten this thing and break your camshafts. You can under tighten it and it might skip your cams. I don't think I had a problem. I think I did a pretty good job of tightening it down. Okay. So a couple things. I'm just going to put on like the water hoses, my little intake attachments, the starter, get all that stuff set up. I think last will be showing you guys how to do the cam timing or lobe separation. Alright, so here comes the somewhat complicated part. I am getting ready to check the lobe separation. Now this looks a little jerry-rigged, and it is. I will say that much. So basically what I have here is my motor. You know, some guys will actually make a plate that sticks off that's metal that they can attach this to because it is a magnet. I just use zip ties. It's good enough for what I'm doing. As you can see, that dial is not moving. What I've done is I've taken a piece of 14-2 kind of copper wire, alright, and I've attached it with some tape to my dial indicator, and what that's going to do is the top of the piston is going to come up and hit that and will let me know when true top dead center is. Now other guys, if you'll see the videos, they affix a piece to the top of the piston and it's a bolt, so then you can hit it and adjust your dial. Basically I came up with this way, that way I can find it, and then I will show you a piece of wire that I'm going to use to attach it. So I'm going to attach my wheel, and then I'll show you how I kind of do it. So I just bought Amazon Moroso degree wheel. Doesn't need to be this brand, you can use whatever you want. Comes with a couple washers. Now the problem I had I believe was I needed a little bit of extra space, so I ended up using 2 of these washers. I just put them back to back. Okay, so that is on there. I'll tighten it a little bit more in just a little bit. I need to get it centered first. So next is, since I didn't really have a bolt for this hole, I used a clamp. So I'm going to go grab a little clamp. I'm basically going to take this wire, loop it around into something that the clamp can actually hold on to. So now I'm going to cut this off. I'll cut it a little bit shorter. Again, I'm going to be bending this around, so it doesn't need to be exact at the moment. Okay, so now I'm going to watch for it to come back up. Okay, so if you saw that, so now it's going back there. Just going to slowly turn it right there. I'm going to set my dial to 0. So I'm going to make sure, so it's a little off. Okay. I went back, now I'm going forward. Okay. You can see I moved my little dial to 0 degrees just by adjusting it. Okay. That is at 0, so it means that the piston is at top dead center. And also make sure that you are lined up with the lines on the, I don't know what you kind of the timing. So I am at full top dead center. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to retighten and make sure that this this bolt is actually tight. Double check my top dead center one last time. Okay. And I loosened the 2 bolts on my camshaft, okay? I then rotated my crank just a little bit to basically adjust where the camshaft sits. It's a guessing game on which way you gotta go. But you just gotta try one direction and see what happens. So now I went off of, so go back, so I went to 20 thousandths. I rolled it back to 10 and it came to 92 degrees. Now I'm going to go to the other side of the top of the lobe. I'm going to see if I can show you. So I'm at one side of the lobe. Now I'm going over to the other side. Now I'm going to 20 thousandths. Now I'm going back to 10. That takes the valve lash out. And then I read my reading, which is 126. So now I take my calculation. So on this, after I moved the camshaft, it went from 100 down to 92. And on the other side, it went from 133.5 to 126. Those added together is 218. Divided by 2 equals 109. So I moved it in the right direction. I've got to move it a little bit more. So I'm going to do that. Other than that, now you guys should know how to do lobe separation, at least a close-up picture of it. Good luck. Alright, so all I can say is I've done all the adjustments like I needed to. I Loctited the camshaft sprockets on, and just to show you, these are all the calculations I went through. Now the top is for exhaust, the bottom is for intake. It's not quite an easy thing. I mean, it gets to the point where you're barely just tapping on the wrench to get the sprocket to move. It doesn't take that much to make a big adjustment. So if you're trying to do a lot, it might be messing you up more than helping you. Again, I was just barely tapping it to make it move, and that was enough. So now I'm gonna finish. I don't know what I'm going to finish. I think I'm going to put on the clutch now. So next I'm going to put on my stator, inside of the stator, I don't know what they call it. I am going to use an impact because it says 65 foot-pounds, and I've tried this to do it on my own, and I cannot get anywhere near 65. So I basically try to crank it up, and I don't have a ton of pressure on my impact, but it does get it, I'm hoping, pretty damn close. On top of that, I did put some Loctite just to help it. Yeah, well, I was just gotta say, watch your fingers. Clutch basket back together, making sure everything turns freely. First is my outer clutch basket. So I've got a billet one here. Make sure your oil pump ring or gear is on there. Now, these two bearings, well, one bearing and one bushing, make sure you put them on after. This gives you enough slop to basically just barely squeeze it on. Otherwise, as you can probably see there, you won't be able to get it on. One thing I did forget to mention, there is a washer here that is beveled on one side. The other side is flat. That bevel needs to go towards the motor. So now that I've got that on, there. Basic flat washer on the inside of the inner clutch basket. Now they do make tools to hold these. I haven't had a problem just holding it. Just make sure you got a good grip so it doesn't ream off your fingers or something. Instruction manual. This one again has a flare, one direction, and it wants the top, or basically it to flare out away from the motor. And then this ring is the very inner ring, and if you can tell the difference, it is about half as thick there. Once those are on, then you're going to basically stagger ring or metal ring and clutch. So these have a rough side and a smooth side. Sometimes you got to feel it. A lot of times I can just look at it, and you're just going to start staggering. The rough side I'm putting out away from the motor. Okay, before I put in the last ones, there's one last ring, and it is just a little bit thicker than all the other ones. That one is my very last guy. Now on the stock Hayabusa clutch basket, you'll have to rotate that last one because there's an extra notch right in the middle of these guys. Mine, I don't need to worry about that. Next is the clutch hat. And make sure there's only, I think on a stock one, there's only one or two ways they'll go on, because there is timing is what they call it. Otherwise, they won't really go on because the teeth on here don't really match up to the teeth on there unless you're in that right position. Now I'm going to put on my springs, and as a lot of you may know or remember my other video where I cut my old spring studs off to make a spacer because my little studs in here are too short. This gives me that half-inch gap, so I have a nice easy spring. Now the cover. And for those of you that do remember, this is the NLR boost lockup clutch. So rather than messing with a bunch of springs and things, it runs off of boost pressure in order to give me my clutch pressure on that hat. And the more boost I make, the more pressure it puts on that line. Other than that, I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull off the pan real fast. Gotta get a couple little metal shavings out of there. I'm gonna add a little bit of oil up into the head before I put it into the bike, just so it has some up top. Get it in the bike, get the fluids filled, turbo on, and that should be it. That is pretty much the building of the motor, right? Hopefully somebody gets some use out of it. But again, I'm not a professional, so don't take all the things I did for the Holy Grail. Good luck if you try it on your own.